Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 583, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of my amendment to the NDAA, which would simply block funds from being made available to the naming commission established by Congress just a few years ago. The intent of that commission was to try to rewrite our nation's history by changing the names of our famous military bases and forts, tearing down statues, and even putting blankets over monuments with names not deemed worthy of remembrance by some. What a tragedy. You only have to look just outside my district at the famous Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia, which has recently been just desecrated by the removal of once famous, beautiful monuments. This effort to remove statues and rename bases encourages an endless cycle of renaming institutions, buildings, and cities across the country under the destructive ruse of political wokeness. Historical sites are healthy environments to observe varied perspectives of historical events, engage diverse viewpoints, and inspire robust conversations as we remember our nation's history. We should protect American memorials to preserve and remember our history. It has been said that those who do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. I urge my colleagues to consider the precedent being set by this arbitrary effort to rewrite our nation's history. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment to preserve our history and fight these reckless efforts to destroy our country, our founders, and our history. And I reserve.
Reserves for the gentleman for Washington.
Thank
recognition.
you, Mr. Chairman. I claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman yields 2 minutes.
This is actually sort of my favorite amendment of the group because it sort of drives home the point. When we talk about history, you got to understand the history of how these bases were named. So we had the Civil War, we got rid of slavery, we tried Reconstruction. Reconstruction did not go well. And then there was a concerted movement in this country to make sure that we continued to establish white supremacy as the way we were going to approach this country. A lot of fascinating books have actually been written about this. It was a very well-coordinated effort. There was an effort to rename all these bases after people from the Confederate War to celebrate white supremacy. And they were all meant, the Ku Klux Klan grew up all over the place. I can't remember the name of the guy, but a guy from my area just wrote a fascinating book about the Ku Klux Klan taking over the state of Indiana and the battle and the fight that went into that. So all of these bases that are named for our history, as you describe it, are monuments to white supremacy. So if you don't support white supremacy, or if, God forbid, you're black or not white, and you're going to go serve at a base that is a monument, historically, it's exactly why it was named that. It was named that as part of an overall concerted effort to establish white supremacy. But we're just going to let that go, all right? That is the kind of thing that undermines good order and discipline in the military, the kind of thing that makes people who aren't white feel like they are not included. Now, I do not believe for 1 second that the United States of America is an essentially racist country or that white supremacy is currently the policy that we are trying to advance. What I cannot understand is why so many people serving in this body don't want to stand up for that basic principle, want to continue to celebrate the worst parts of our history instead of the best parts. These monuments are supposed to reflect our values. This is not a value we should be reflecting. And oh, by the way, this is why we still need diversity, equity, and inclusion programs to try to educate people on these very fundamental facts that they ought to know. Please, if you supported all the others, please oppose this amendment. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman for Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I'm privileged to recognize the chairman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
For how much time?
1 minute.
1 minute, sir.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank my friend from Virginia. I want to urge adoption of this amendment. I want to remind people that this commission was established for the purpose of renaming our major military installations that had been named after Confederate officers. That mission is complete. There is no reason for us to continue to spend funding on this commission to hunt for things to do. We were told it was going to cost only $1 million. They've gone over $30 million. We need to just let them complete their job, which they've done, stop this funding, and adopt this amendment. I urge a favorable vote on my colleague's amendment.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, the gentleman from Alabama, and I reserve.
Gentleman from reserves. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Virginia.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to personalize the remarks alluded to by our ranking member. Because I was born black in Virginia, raised there. I represent the former capital of the Confederacy. My entire family was raised in the former Confederacy. And for my entire life, I've lived in the shadow of Robert E. Lee and his fellow Confederate generals. He was a looming presence in my hometown of Petersburg, where the former Fort Lee sits. He was a looming presence in my neighborhood. And I want to talk about the monument that the gentleman from Virginia alluded to. One of the largest monuments to General Lee stood for 130 years around the corner from my house, which is ironic because General Lee himself did not believe monuments to Confederate generals should be erected, because he recognized that countries where there is a civil war, monuments to the losing side help to foster wounds that haven't healed. That's exactly what happened in this country. That monument and many others were put up as part of a backlash to the social, political, and economic gains of formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. Another wave were put up as a backlash to Brown versus Board and the gains of the civil rights movement. When that monument came down, I felt a weight lifted off of my shoulders that I didn't know I was carrying. It was the burden of having to drive past a man who fought against the country he swore to serve to keep my ancestors enslaved, who himself owned people who could have been my ancestors and was documented to be horrifically cruel to them. We are trying to recruit a diverse armed services. We need to recruit the sons and daughters and granddaughters of the descendants of slaves.
Gentlelady's
and
time has
having them
expired.
walk into a building on a base named for their former oppressors is not going to create a welcoming environment. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington reserves. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, the true history of America is that no nation in the history of the world has rescued more people, freed more people, fed more people, ministered to more people, and yes, evangelized more people around the globe. No nation in the history of the world has been more welcoming to people from all nationalities, all races, all ethnicities, and given more opportunity, more upward mobility to people of, again, all races, all ethnicities, all nationalities. No nation in the history of the world did as the United States did just some 85 years after declaring our independence, where the nation went to war with itself, where the majority population suffered great loss of blood and treasure to free the minority population. No nation in the history of the world has that happened like it's happened in the United States of America. It was our founding documents and principles that provided the framework for us to realize our ideals of all men being created equal, endowed by our Creator by unalienable rights. The United States is unique among the nations of the world. Our history is worth preserving. It's worth protecting. It's worth remembering. It's worth honoring from. It's worth honoring, and it's worth learning and growing from. And I reserve. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
I believe we have the right to close on this.
You do?
Is that correct? Then I will reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, it is time to defund this naming commission. It's time for us to move past these efforts to change our history, and it's time for us to preserve our history and our founders and our principles of our nation, and to defund this naming commission. And I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you. I yield myself the balance of my time. And I actually agree with what the gentleman listed in terms of the great things that this country has done. and what is beyond belief is why in the name of God would we choose to celebrate the particular aspects of our history that don't reflect those values that the gentleman just explained. I want to talk about all the great things that the United States of America has done. I don't want to talk about our history of white supremacy. I want to understand it and make sure that we don't ever repeat it. And I have an enormous amount of respect for the chairman of the committee, but I want to make sure everyone understands what we're voting on here. This is to prohibit the use of federal funds to carry out the recommendations of the base naming commission. So to say that, oh, they're done, it doesn't really matter. This is going to block what they did. This is going to stop the ability to change those names. This commission was passed on a bipartisan basis to make sure that this is implemented. This amendment would gut that and go against that bipartisan agreement and the work that they have done. So please understand what you're doing, and as I said earlier, it is something we should not be doing. I urge a no vote.
Expired. The question